Hey, welcome back. This is episode number 13 of Design Over Time. This is a daily video log series in which I talk about game design topics, and you get a new topic just about every day. So today we will be talking about Rhythm Heaven, and as you can see down below, Rhythm Heaven Megamix is the fourth game in the series. So I played every single one, starting on the GBA, the DS, the Wii, and now for the 3DS. And I want to just do a couple of quick comparisons, hit a couple of topics, not stay too long because I know I have a ton I want to say about this game. I actually want to do a level breakdown of all the mini games that are in Megamix, and since Megamix is sort of like the game that has all the other mini games in the one package, it'd be a really good way to look at the variety and the interesting level design across the entire series. But that's not what we're doing today. Today we're just going to be focusing on a few elements that I think I really need to point out for this rhythm action game, and it kind of sets the stage for talking about just about every other kind of action game we will discuss on this channel or consider as critics, players, developers, whatever. So if you overthink it, then you might be prone to putting rhythm games and other kinds of simple games like this into their own category, their own consideration, and consider them very differently than you do action games, fighting games, MMOs, RPGs, whatever other genre you can think of. But from a design perspective, they're all built out of the same kinds of things. So I'm not going to, treat it any differently than we do any other kind of genre. I'm just going to jump right in, and we're going to talk about a few aspects that are on the pretty low level. Like, I'll show you the wheel here. So today we're going to talk a little bit about mechanics, and specifically the input controls for these various versions of Rhythm Heaven, the devices we use to control them, and the input action. We will also be talking about feedback. Feedback's a big deal. The last thing I want to talk about was just a little bit of level design and how Rhythm Heaven create sort of a mega mix, right? A remix of all the previous challenges that you've encountered in the game for one epic climactic final piece. So let's jump right back into the notes. And here we are, controls right here. So just to run through this really simply because we don't have a lot of time, the GBA just uses the A button, and occasionally a few games use multiple buttons, and the D-pad, occasionally a few games use different directions on the D-pad, but it's mostly just the A button. It keeps things pretty simple. The DS uses all touchscreen, and just with the stylus you can tap, hold, flick, and scratch, and those are your four main ways of inputting into the game. Taps just being taps. I'll show you. But taps are basically like this. Hold is what you expect. Flick is a flicking off the top of your touchscreen wrist action like that, and scratch is where you hold and then move it around to the beat and then release or flick off or whatever. Very rarely in the DS version do you have to hold L for any reason, so you're holding it like a book, and sometimes you have to hold, I think it's R actually, but depending on if you're left or right-handed, you hold one of the shoulder buttons and you do stuff, but that's super rare. I think only the guitar game does that. I wrote an article about controller design. It's like an 11-part series or 12-part series, and here's where I address the whole touchscreen flick-based controls versus button and the pros and cons of both, and ultimately why I like the touchscreen controls better. You can check that out on my blog anytime. And then you have the Wii version. The Wii version uses only the Wiimote, and it kept things pretty simple. The entire game is controlled only with the A button. And the A and B button is your secondary button, because it would be kind of weird sometimes to hit this button on the bottom of the Wiimote, so they just made it to an A-B squeeze, and that just has a really good, firm, consistent game feel, and I really do like the A-B button together. I think it's actually superior to what we get in Rhythm Heaven Megamix, which is the 3DS version. Here's what's interesting about the 3DS version. It uses button-based or touchscreen controls, and the buttons are, I should separate this just for clarity. The buttons use A button mostly, and the B button is used instead of the A and B button. So for all the mini games that they imported from the Wii version into this DS version, instead of squeezing the Wiimote like this, you pretty much just tap the B button right there. So it's A or B, and the reason I don't really like that is because the A and B button have sort of the same input feel, and even though your hand's pretty much resting in default position, it can be pretty easy to miss one versus the other. So there are some games that convert the A-B button press into just the B button. Some games leave it as an A press, and that can get kind of confusing when you don't know exactly how they translated it from the previous control scheme. So Sometimes I hit the B button and it only wanted A. Sometimes I stayed on the A and it actually wanted B, and that's just a tiny little detail. I mean, it's consistent within its own rules, but making that transition was a little bit rough. Yeah, and sometimes the entire D-pad is used for the 3DS version. Instead of the left, right, up, down, you can hit any button on the D-pad, which treats it like a giant button. I think that's a pretty good idea for simplifying things. The touchscreen controls are a little disappointing. Instead of the DS-style tap, flick, hold, and scratch, they simplified the entire thing down to just tap. Instead of worrying about the D-pad controls, A or B button or anything like that, they pretty much made a mode in this game that you can play with one hand and not worry too much about complicated inputs. So, you know, it's cool for that kind of casual mode of play, but for the most part, the touchscreen controls overall are not as engaging as a DS, not as versatile, and it actually simplifies the entire game for a much easier version. So take it or leave it, that's how it works. Okay, so here's what I really want to talk about in terms of Rhythm Heaven. Rhythm Heaven is my favorite rhythm action game of all time. This series is just super clean, super effective. It's got tons of variety, it's got tons of sort of character and charm and all that cool stuff. But the fact that it can create these really clearly communicated, really sort of pure and well executed gameplay challenges is why I think it's a step above most other rhythm games. And it does that by making the critical feedback that you need to know be both auditory and visual, right? Most of the mini games inside of Rhythm Heaven present both kinds of feedback for clarity and effectiveness. So instead of just picking one or the other, they just kind of make the entire experience sort of richly communicative.
Hey, baby, how's it going? It's non-stop.
Oh yeah.
Hey, baby.
So whether or not word phrases or sound cues are given, sometimes special animations or symbols are given and displayed above your character. That's pretty cool. But sometimes, or most of the time, you should get both. Like, you should be able to hear it coming and see it coming, and that should really cue you in on what you need to do and when you need to do it. But this gives your eyes the freedom to wander around the screen, and even if your ears are overloaded, you can trust your eyes. It's really easy to sort of lose focus and to get distracted when playing anything and trying to focus for a long period of time. So this layered sense of feedback, this redundant feedback, is really effective. So unlike other rhythm games that have a really high action frequency, Rhythm Heaven gives you the time to enjoy the visuals, animations, and the facial expressions and funny jokes as you play. Rhythm Heaven is not so concerned like Guitar Hero with like playing lots of notes and rapidly and never missing the beat. It's not as engaging frequency-wise, action frequency-wise, as Wind On or Elite Beat Agents, where you're constantly tapping, holding, dragging, spinning, whatever. This game, it's really sort of conservative in that aspect. It's really clean. It's really just making really simple rhythms and playing around with making and breaking those expectations rather than giving you a hard note track or rapid fire notes in order to challenge you. And that's one of the reasons why I think this game does so well. Another cool detail that I like about Rhythm Heaven is that the elements on the screen keep the beat with their body language. So even in between beats, like I said, you're not going to have a lot of action frequency in this game. When you're waiting in between beats, the characters on the screen keep the beat. Everything about the game is sort of like lively, it's in tune with the beat, it's active. And that kind of keeps you into the flow of things, and I think that's a really subtle but important touch. One thing that I love about the DS game and the later versions of Rhythm Heaven is they used their extra processing power. They really thought more about how do we improve the visual communication and the feedback of this game, and they added more detail, more animations, more sound effects, and now you get a really clear sense of if you get a perfect hit, a near hit, an okay beat, or a failure. They build those different states into the animations themselves, and I'll show you one really cool screenshot. Lines of Communication is an article I wrote just talking about feedback. I wrote this in 2010, so about 6 years ago. And one of the things I did note specifically was Rhythm Heaven. I'll show you this picture. And this is a game called Philbots. I'll show you it in a bit, but look, if you get a perfect, your little robot rockets off the side of the screen. If you get a near perfect, he just dances, you know. You get too much, and then you can see that the liquid is just sort of bursting out of its head and it's freaking out a little bit. If you don't get enough, you can see the color is not as rich. The head's tilted to the side, the expression says everything. You see this tiny little bit you miss, that means you let go too early. And if you miss even the start of the feeling action, you know, you can obviously tell that the nozzle missed the top of the head. So these little touches I think go a long way, and it really helps both keep you visually engaged with what's happening on the screen, and it tells you how you're doing as far as being on the beat or not. So here's what the new Rhythm Heaven Megamix does. This is the second game on a DS-like console. You know, the GBA and the Wii version only have one screen, but the designers had to figure out what to do with their extra screens. So here, as you can see, the 3DS game turns the entire bottom screen into a universal visual feedback system. So that means you get a rainbow animation for a perfect hit, and the rainbow animation is dead center on the bottom screen. So even if you're not focused on the bottom screen entirely, both seeing the rainbow animation and seeing that it's dead center just helps you know that you were perfectly on the beat. Near perfects are yellow star animation. You know, if you're ahead of the beat, it's further to the left, as in like the beat track is moving like this, and then if you're ahead of the beat, it'll pop right there. If you're behind the beat, it'll be further to the right of the screen, and that's a really clear way to see just how close you were to the beat. And I'm assuming it's measuring that at a very fine degree, sort of as fine as it can. And misses are little red circles that are on the very edges of the screen. So that gives you a really good visual ruler in order to measure your timing attempts in the game. So I think that's a really smart use of the second screen on the 3DS. So let's talk about score. The scoring system is another feedback system in a video game. It lets you know, out of all the actions you did, how well you did those actions. The scoring system in Rhythm Heaven Megamix is now more detailed than ever. Before, the game only calculated simple hits and misses, and if you don't miss any, you get a perfect score, and that's great. But now, whether you get a perfect or not, it's actually measuring if you get near perfects and perfects. And it gives you a 100-point scale to let you know exactly how perfect you are. So, you know, I think that's great. Previously, the Rhythm Heaven games, even though they were super sort of strict, Japanese music rhythm games tend to be more strict than Western style music rhythm games, even though there's not really a lot of them out there to begin with. Now we have a feedback system that lets you know that the game is super strict, and you can actually aim for perfection even beyond just not missing any notes. So I think that's a really good thing for the series. Before, it never had anything like this, so once you get your perfect, you move on. But now I'm aiming for those like 98, 99. I've never gotten 100, but it's super hard to be frame perfect on beat for any period of time. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, remixes. So in true WarioWare fashion, WarioWare being one of the greatest action games and still untapped potential that people have no idea how good WarioWare is. But in true WarioWare fashion, the remixes take the individual rhythm games and string them together in some kind of a, as you might guess, remix. And even though the order of the mini games is completely predetermined, like in WarioWare it's random, but in this game it's predetermined, it's just a lot of fun rushing through so many different mini games and playing with so many rules and rapidly changing. It's just one of the reasons why Rhythm Heaven is such an interesting series for music rhythm games. In these remixes, there are no brief transitions or instructional messages between the micro rhythm games. So in WarioWare, you might get a cool transition, and then when you go into a new game, you get that information like dig, and you have to follow the instructions. In this game, there is nothing. The cuts in between mini games sometimes are less than a second before you have to be hitting the button again on time. Sometimes you get an audio cue for the Switch, sometimes you just get a visual cue, sometimes you get both. It's really tuned on a case-by-case basis. So this is one of the final levels in the entire game. It's all crazy. So I'm just going to show you and point out a couple of the interesting feedback things they do in between the mini games. So in this one you have to pay attention to what object, how big it is in order to know how many to hit. There's no audio cues for that one. This one has audio and visual cues. Only audio. See that? Okay. Right there. See that monkey? That monkey right there flying past the Munchie Monk? Super important. So that's actually a heads up saying there's a monkey minigame coming, and don't be surprised when it happens. But it's still in the background, so you don't have to pay too much attention to it right now. There, so the monkey's flying in, and you're like, oh, I'm about to play the monkey game. You can kind of hear it with the music, and the visual cue and the audio cue are really letting you know that this. And they even gave you a 3 go, so the game really tries to help you not be taken by surprise. And that was a perfect example. So right before the next beat happens in this little petri dish mini game, it actually cuts abruptly, and then you're right in time to do the beat for the next game. Look at this. Like right on beat. You don't miss a beat. So this one's visual cue and audio cue, but you gotta look exactly with the different timings of the fruit. This one gives you an audio cue and when to double tap it. Like that. The cat is your only cue. And this is one of those steady beat mini games, and you have an audio cue for when to flap. Nice smooth transition. Here's another smooth transition. 2, 3, 4, march. Just like that. So that one's all mostly audio cue based. So this one's audio cue based. You gotta go with the lyrics. I suppose. Audio cue only. And that one gave you an audio cue in transition, so that's kind of rare. You can hear the frogs talking right here. 1, 2, 3, 4. One, two.
1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. Go, go, go!
Nice perfects right there. Look at Game & Watch in the back. So one thing I want to point out here is sometimes you're asked to do a lot of rapid rhythms in a game, and it's really easy to sort of lose your focus. You're like, okay, I'm on beat, but you slowly start drifting, and you don't exactly know if you're drifting too close one way or the other because it's kind of hard. But the bottom screen, because you're always drifting behind the beat when the sparkles are on the right side and ahead of the beat when they're on the left, this player is able to recognize that they're drifting, and you can see it in the middle. It started off, drifted back towards the center, went off, and drifted back. And that game is really cool, even though the player doesn't show it. But if you are slightly off the beat, your golf ball that you're striking misses the hole and then kind of rolls back in. So you can see how close you are to the beat based on those animations. But most of the time, if you hit the pole or go into the hole, you've gotten a perfect. So you can see it right here. So this one's complicated. They give you audio cues and visual cues, and you can see that the light bulb is yellow here, which represents a punch kick. A barrel's going to fly after you see a yellow light bulb, and then that's going to be a two-stager. Like that. But as soon as you see a blue light bulb, that means it's a rapid fire combo. I'll show you. There, blue light bulb. And that's the end. So that's what a Megamix is like. This game is really, really cool. And those are mostly all the cool things I wanted to point out. So yeah, rhythm action games are just like any other game. Whatever challenge you want to present to the player, it makes a big difference on whether or not you can do that cleanly, whether or not your controls are good, and whether or not you can sort of iterate on your challenges. Even if your challenges are as linear as possible, which music rhythm games are typically highly linear, there's no stopping the creativity of what you can do when you really start to mix and match and do interesting things with your level design. There's really no stopping what you can do. So that's why I think Rhythm Heaven is one of the greatest games of all times, but certainly my favorite rhythm action games. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of Design Over Time. You can follow us, by subscribing down below, and you can follow us on Twitter at DesignOriented, or you can follow me at KirbyKid. I do one of these videos every day, and if you have any questions, just leave them down below or get to me on Twitter, and I will certainly answer your questions. But until tomorrow, this has been Design Over Time. Peace.